humans. Welcome to the Human Beauty Movement podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Norman. Throughout my life, I've been a lover and a seeker of all things beauty, from art and dance to cosmetics and fashion to music and nature. But through my own personal journey, I've come to discover what I believe is the most beautiful thing in the universe, the beauty of the human soul. On this podcast, I sit down with beautiful humans from all corners of the globe and all walks of life to learn how they are living their own unique soul beauty out loud. You'll hear from game changers, rebels with great causes, sages, odds beaters, and valiant warriors who fall down 7 times and get up 8. This is the podcast where abundant energy flows and supreme wisdom is bestowed. Get ready to enjoy the inspiration. Hello, beautiful humans. I'm Jennifer Norman, founder of the Human Beauty Movement and your host. Now, let's face it, some subjects are just harder to talk about than others, but we must talk about them because raising awareness and spreading understanding can actually help save lives. So this episode comes with a trigger warning because we're going to talk about how to prevent suicide. We all get shaken when we hear the news that someone took his or her own life. Deaths of seemingly happy or successful people like Robin Williams, Anthony Bourdain, Alexander McQueen, and Stephen Twitch Boss are reminders that people may be hurting more severely than they let on. My special guest today is Johanna Louie, a licensed social worker and co-founder of Suicide is Different, which aims to address gaps in resources for caregivers supporting people experiencing suicidal thoughts. A warm welcome to you, Johanna.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's great to be here.
I'm so delighted to have you. And yes, this is such an important topic. And I first off want to say thank you for the work that you do. I would love for you to share with everybody your background. Tell us about how you got into this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the invite and being able to share a little bit about my story and also some ways that we can all work together towards preventing suicide and making it something that is easier to talk about, I think. So my first interaction with suicide happened in college, really. And it was the first time that I think for a lot of people, right? First time you're away from home, first time you are kind of more on your own, and experiencing caring for someone who was thinking about suicide was just something that no one told me that I might encounter in college, right? People told me like, you're gonna have to choose your major, look for internships and all of those things, but no one really prepares you for that.
Yeah.
And I think the challenging thing is like, you're barely learning to take care of yourself, let alone be put into a position to kind of care for others. I felt like a lot of people would like assume that like, okay, she should be able to do it. I was a social ecology major that took a lot of psychology classes. I was a peer educator at the counseling center, and I never learned anything about suicide. I never learned how to talk about it. And that really was my first kind of window into like, wow, there's not a lot of support out there. And it did plant a seed of something that I was interested in, right? Like I was able to get the people that needed help connected to the counseling center where I was part of, but I still didn't really know what to do. And because of that interest, a couple years later, I actually ended up starting as a volunteer on a crisis line locally. And that was really the start of my professional journey. And since then, I've been involved within the suicide prevention space, ranging from like a more volunteer perspective, kind of managing programs, consultant basis, and also like doing more clinical work more recently as I kind of like I'm learning different facets of the field and hopefully now like really focusing on supporting caregivers.
That's fantastic. And how amazing that you really dove in after college and said, this is something that I really think is important and that I want to dedicate my time to. So thank you for volunteering and for continuing this as your profession. So I think that a lot of people, they hear about suicide and it's like one of those topics that is just so uncomfortable because no one knows what to say. Nobody knows really what to do. We know that there are tools out there, but it seems like individual situations are varied and different. Can you tell us what are some of the things that maybe to start off with might be some signs that, hey, there's something going on that maybe I should lean in a little bit more and pay attention to as a friend, as a family member? What would you say?
Yeah, I think that I always tell folks, trust your gut. I think that if you are noticing something is different, that that typically is something to follow up on. So I think that if you're finding yourself concerned, there's probably a reason, and really kind of following that. In terms of specific, warning signs and risk factors, I think that there are a lot of different things, right? Like hearing someone's talking about death, right? If someone is giving away their belongings, they might be engaging in more risky behaviors. I think that warning signs and risk factors are pretty well documented when we see these signs, right? When we see that someone's feeling down, when we're seeing that someone is perhaps like increasing their alcohol drug use, right? They're withdrawing from activities, isolating themselves. What's really important is also noticing like a change in their baseline. So I always use the example when I'm doing trainings and whatnot that like if someone never leaves the house without putting their makeup on and dressing really nicely, and then suddenly like you have to drag them out of the house and they want to go outside in pajamas, right? That's a very notable difference. Whereas like when I was in college, if you saw me wearing sweatpants during finals week outside, that probably doesn't mean too much. So I think that kind of being able to notice the differences in behavior, I think is a really big one, and really great to kind of see warning signs and risk factors. I think to your point earlier, it just differs for different people, that being able to kind of notice like changes, I think, and then following your gut, I would say that those are my top two kind of advice for folks when they ask me what to look out for.
Fascinating. And I was looking at some statistics from the CDC. I think that the latest data that I could find was from like 2020 as a wrap up. And it was saying that like there's a suicide every 11 minutes or in the United States, or about 130 per day. So, I mean, it's quite pervasive. And I think there are some specific groups that have a higher propensity for suicide than others. I think that, folks that are in the lesbian, gay, or bisexual communities have a higher rate of suicidal thoughts or behaviors compared to peers who identify as heterosexual. White males also tend to have a higher propensity to actually execute upon a suicide. But even females, I think that females have like a 1.5 higher chance of actually trying to or having thoughts of suicide versus other groups, which is quite alarming.
Yeah, I think some other statistics that really kind of guide some newer programming is just around youth and suicide amongst youth, like it being very commonly top three cause of death for folks younger than 24, right? I think just behind kind of accidental deaths. So I think that's another area that we think about a lot when we kind of do this work and think about like what populations we want to really focus on. I think one of the things that also I like to remind folks is that like suicide doesn't discriminate, even while like I think statistics are so helpful in terms of making sure that, like the right resources are customized for certain populations, kind of recognizing that no one's necessarily in the clear, so to speak. The idea that like, things can build up for folks. And even if like a lot of times we're only seeing a snippet of someone's life and it might not look that bad from our point of view, but recognizing that as things build up, it's going to be harder and harder for them to envision a future. And that can really lead to decreased hope and lead to thoughts of suicide as well.
You're exactly right. I often wonder because there is probably a correlation between depression or certain mental health conditions and suicide. And while there seems to be like a movement towards people saying, oh, if somebody's negative or if they seem like they're like an energy vampire, then you don't need to spend too much time with them. Like, guard yourself. And so it tends to isolate people that might be having an issue or having problems. It's not as compassionate as saying, hey, I'm going to be there for you no matter what. I think that there's something going on here. And so there is seemingly fine balance between making sure that you're preserving your own emotional and mental wellness and also having enough love for yourself and enough strength to be able to consider and care for those that are around you too.
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually like one of the basis of why suicide is different was founded. We really recognize that the caregiver needs support too. When you look at like folks who know someone who's thinking about suicide, the Harris poll did a study a couple years back, and they talked about how 50% of adults actually said that they knew someone who was thinking about suicide or mentioned suicide in some way. And generally people want to help. Like I think the numbers were either 95% of people reported, hey, like I would want to do something, but the biggest barrier being I don't know what to do. And that causes fear. And I think that when we think about that, that's why we felt like having a service specifically specifically for caregivers, allowing them to really think through, how am I going to approach this? Who else is part of the care team? It's not all on me. I don't have to be everything for this person. And then being able to think about, like, what does taking care of myself look like? How do I sustain being a support for others, making sure that it doesn't drain me, right? Because we all have limits, as much as we like to think sometimes, oh, we can do anything. And I think that's a great mindset, but we all ultimately do have some limitations, and being able to recognize what those are and ensure that, like, hey, when we take care of ourselves, that's the best way for us to take care of others. But also, I can transfer care. And if I'm not in a place, I'm going to connect this person with other support, I think is a really big key there too. So I definitely agree that, like, being able to be even in the space to be able to provide support is not something that's easy to do.
I think, stepping back to some of your earlier work when you were, working hotlines and like that, I think about the folks that call in and they're like, I need help. Thank goodness there's resources like that where people, like, they don't know where to turn, but they know that they need help. And there's somebody on the other end of the line that cares and knows. I had heard this amazing story about somebody who got a phone call. I think it was a person who worked in a bookstore, got a phone call from a friend, and the friend was like, I'm saying goodbye. This is the end. And the person was on the phone. I think that it was a gay bookstore, and was like trying to talk this person off of the ledge, but was at work and wanted to try to be as quiet as possible because there were people in the bookstore. But then suddenly people started noticing the kind of phone call that was happening. And so they started to tap the person on the shoulder. They were like, my turn. I got this. And one by one, they all started to line up and took turns talking compassionately and lovingly to this person on the phone, because they're like, we've all been there. We've all felt this way. We know what it's like. And it just caused me to like well up with tears. Thank goodness there are people that care, and probably saved that person's life in that moment, because it's just, if you do something impulsive, it's like, at least you have somebody to turn to, even if it's strangers, they will come to your aid. And so I'm just curious, like, what those conversations must have been like when you were on that other end of the phone and you've got somebody that's in an emergent situation, like how you diffuse and get them to a place where they feel better. That to me is like magic. And if anybody has like a nugget that they can take away from that, I think would be just so important.
Yeah, I think that the story that you mentioned, I actually think highlights what the magic is. And that's compassion, right? Compassion, being willing to listen, kindness, and taking the time, right? And I actually would love to highlight like the new number that's been out since the middle of last year, 988. I think that's a really good resource, free of charge, 24/7. There's obviously other crisis lines out there with the Trevor Project and other kind of resources that are available. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of these crisis lines are volunteer ran. Obviously, the volunteers are going through very intensive training. They are being supervised. However, they're not necessarily taught all these clinical skills, right? And I think that what it is the compassion, is taking the time. And I think that we live in an age where we're pretty hung up on like, I want to say the right thing. I want to make sure that everything is perfect. I don't want to say anything offensive and rub them the wrong way. I think that a lot of people, what they don't realize is that oftentimes, even if you say the wrong thing, so to speak, people are very perceptive and can tell that like you didn't mean that, right? Like even when people are in crisis, most of the time they might tell you like, hey, I didn't really feel that way, or I don't like that you just said that, or maybe they might take a step back and you can kind of be like, okay, maybe something came out wrong and I can address it. I think that a lot of times it's not about saying the right words, because there are probably no right words, to be honest. And it's about the feeling that you can allow them to feel of like, hey, you're not alone in this moment. I got you, right? Like I'm here with you. I'm going to sit here with you. I'm here to listen. And that human connection, I think, is so important. And I would honestly say that that's the magic sauce. We can, of course, talk a little bit more about the technical things to ask just to make sure that that person is safe. We can talk about that a little bit more. But I would say that like just kind of being there for someone, sitting in that dark place with them and not jumping to, it's going to be okay, don't worry about it, but being like, that sucks, tell me more. That is really where the magic is.
Yeah, being present and listening. It sounds like even if you don't say anything, I'm here, I've got you, I'm here to listen. You're not alone in this, and just talk. Let me hear what's going on. Even if it's just that, it sounds like that is helpful, right?
100%. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for, right? Making connections, being able to feel like there's hope, right? Because I think earlier I talked about how a lot of times it's a buildup of things, right? And it's hard for them to see the future, see that there can be tomorrow. And I think that when we're we're helping them make connections to life. We're building a connection with them. That's really what's so powerful about conversations.
Okay. And then if it is a phone call that you're on, or if it's a text, then what might be some of those safety questions that would be helpful just to make sure that they're not in any imminent danger?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear about suicide, when they think about like what might the response be, a lot of times like, okay, it's a yes or no question. And when you ask someone, are you thinking about suicide? Sure, that technically is a yes or no question. But when you want to understand suicidality, it's a little bit beyond that,
Mm,
right? We are trying to understand the intricacies of it, the nuance of it, because if someone says, yes, they are thinking about suicide, I just don't want to be here anymore, that's very different than someone telling me, yes, I'm thinking about suicide. I checked the medicine cabinet and I know that I have these painkillers left over from my previous surgery.
mm,
I have enough to have a
mm,
dose that will be lethal. I Googled this and I'm going to
mm,
take steps to do that today, right? That's a very different story. So being able to get a better sense of like, okay, yes or no. If it's no, then like you kind of move forward with, the conversations, talking about what's going on. But if the answer is yes, like, okay, tell me a little bit more about that, right? Have you done anything already today to act on these thoughts? Are you safe right now? I just want to know that to make sure that we can have a conversation. Of course, if you're in person with this person, that might not be a question that you need to ask, but maybe, right? If you're kind of noticing that there's some physical signs that they might not be doing too well, inquiring a little bit about like, hey, how much have you thought about this? Like, do you have a plan for what you might do? Have you thought about when you would do this? Maybe where you would do this? Tell me a little bit more about even the past, right? We know that like people who have attempted suicide in the past are more likely to make another suicide attempt. So
mm,
different questions, I think like that can really help paint a fuller picture. And why I talk about it in a spectrum is because I think a lot of times people hear yes to suicide and they kind of shut down or run away, or maybe they're like, oh, I need to call the emergency services, right? There's a whole range of responses when a lot of times when someone is thinking about it passively, just listening and being there is really the key. But obviously, there are times when we do need to get a professional involved. I always encourage folks who don't have too much training in this that, hey, like you don't have to be alone in doing this, right? There are a lot of tools out there. If you Google questions to ask, suicide spectrum, there's like web pages that kind of can lead you through this. But I always say the best resource is to call a crisis line together. Have the crisis counselors help with doing a assessment, or even if they're really against it, you can call the crisis line before the conversation to kind of write down some of these questions and get some guidance, because
mm.
you're going to have more context. Use it kind of like a consultation. There's actually a lot of third party calls at these crisis lines. A lot of people are like, well, I'm not the one in crisis, I shouldn't be calling, but them supporting you is a form of suicide prevention, right? So I think it is important for folks to know that that's a service to help you gain more knowledge around how to conduct an assessment, get a better sense of what's going on, and recognize like what your next steps can be.
Amazing. Now, I was astonished to learn that suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 25 to 34, but most shockingly to me, 10 to 14. I couldn't believe that suicide is the second leading cause of death among children 10 to 14 years old. I mean, that is just heartbreaking. And so, if I think about parents as caretakers, imagining that a lot of your clients or the folks that you're working with are parents, and it's like when they've got kids that say, like, they want to end it all. And sometimes you don't know if they're just doing it for attention. Sometimes you just have a combative relationship. And so it's like, how in the world? And they're practically speaking different languages because youth are so into their own culture versus perhaps a parent. And, there seems to be a bit of a divide between the relationship of some parents and kids. And so I'm just curious about, like, for those that are caretakers, and I know that you had mentioned that a lot of what people can do is take care of themselves first. If you're a parent that's already stressed out and overwhelmed, and I know how, being a working parent myself, it's like there's only so much that they can do. But then when you have a child who's extremely difficult, might be into drugs, or there's peer pressure at school, which is just, too much for the child to bear. Like, are there any things in the toolkit that parents in particular of at-risk children can be advised of?
Yeah, I think that all of the things that you mentioned are the biggest challenges, right? Most of the clients that I work with are parents. It's something that they have added pressure on. And there's so many different emotions, I think, for parents. I think one that they commonly face is that there's a sense of, did I cause this? I think that a lot of parents that I've worked with have also said when we're in the therapist's office, right, they are like, what did you do? Right? It's kind of like the blame is casted on the parents and unfortunately disproportionately on mothers as well. So I think that this is such an important topic, right? How do parents kind of engage? And I always suggest parents take the time to take a step back and think about what your values and beliefs are around suicide. Because again, right, like I mentioned earlier, there's never going to be the right words to say, but it's like your children are very perceptive and they can feel where you're coming from and kind of like your intentions and whatnot. And when parents take the time to really think about maybe some biases that they have around suicide and address that first and really make sure that they're approaching talking about suicide and they're approaching caring for their child with, hey, I just want you to be okay, right? Like I'm not coming into this with the judgment that I might have around suicide at large, right? I think that's really important. Of course, there are scenarios where maybe there's a crisis at hand and we're not able to kind of go through that first. I always tell parents like being able to ask directly is also really key. Parents are in a position to help kind of make the environment safe, right? Whether that's, removing pills from the medicine cabinet, ensuring that if they have guns in the home, that children do not have access to them, right? Ensuring that razors are not accessible, if knives are like stored safely. There's a lot that parents can tangibly do as well. And I think that being able to kind of think through some of those things, learn some skills around how to approach the topic and also how to ask about it and how to have conversations with the child, they can really sense that like, hey, this is coming out of care. And then getting them to professional supports and hopefully being open to working collaboratively with the professionals, right? I think that that's also really key. A lot of times what happens is when someone is in treatment for their maybe depression, whatnot, and it's like there are suicidal thoughts involved, the therapist, or even if it's like you go to the emergency room, you call crisis line. What they do is work on a safety plan with the person. And I think that being able to talk through that safety plan with the child, saying like, okay, I know that these things can activate certain emotions in you. Next time I notice them, I can help remind you that like, hey, are you okay? I'm going to take it as an invitation to check in, right? There's a list of things that they can do. And when your child is in crisis, it's likely that they might not remember those things, right? So helping them make it more accessible, right? Maybe they like to go for a bike ride. Can we buy a bike and have that be something that they can do? Or maybe we can do together as a family. So I think that like being able to collaborate on what safety can look like can be a really important part and really involve the parent so that they're not just sort of in this like at a distance. I think that sometimes I've heard that from parents, like they feel like they just take their child to therapy and they don't know what's going on there. And then they're like, well, the therapist only needs to see my child for an hour or a couple hours a week when I have to be with them for 24/7. So I think that being able to be involved in that way is really important as well.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about, some of the examples that I've come across where, there might be a divorce where maybe, the dad leaves or what have you. And then all of a sudden the child feels like they're no longer loved. And there's this whole sense of oppression and identity that gets disintegrated, which leads to self-mutilation or just troubling behaviors and could spiral. But yeah, and the parent who's left there feels helpless. Like there's like, you're telling me to buy a bike? It's like it's almost
For
like
sure.
what more can I do to make sure that my child is safe and healthy? And it almost feels like the world is working against you, where it's like everything in the media or anything at school, like it just seems like your children might be subjected to all of these negative influences that are beyond the parent's control. And meanwhile, everybody's pointing their finger at the parent and saying, you should have known, or, you should have a handle on your own child. And then that makes them feel even guiltier. So it's a whole spiral. But it sounds like, the first thing to do is just that open communication. It sounds like that is the start of any good relationship. It's just like trying to be present in there to talk through or really have a heart-to-heart conversation, maybe a key to unlocking a certain healthier habit and ways to help. Not always. ways, but certainly that might be one way.
Yeah, a theme that I actually recently had a conversation with a client and we came up with a theme of over communication, right? There's nothing that I should be assuming about my child, right? I'm going to bring up conversations. And one of the things that actually I've noticed work well with a lot of parents that I work with is also giving more autonomy to their child, right? So instead of saying like, I need to have a conversation with you about something really important, we need to do it right now. Let them know, hey, I want to talk with you about some things regarding, how you've been doing. I know that it takes emotional labor to have these conversations. It takes energy. I know you have like a lot of exams or something this week. When do you think might be a good time for us to have this conversation, right? Of course, space determining by like crisis and safety, there might be times when you have to give a little bit less autonomy, but doing something like that can help the child feel, hey, like I feel my boundaries are being respected. I feel that it's not just my parents are making this choice for me. I have a say in when I talk about this, whether it's that or instead of saying like, hey, you have to go to a therapist, saying like, hey, let's look for a therapist together. Let's make sure that we find the right fit and we find a program. We can look through the treatment centers and their websites and you can pick which one you think that you would want to go to the most. So again, instead of being more directive, allowing them to gain more power in the situation in a way that's safe. I think those two factors are kind of common themes that I've seen work well for parents.
Wonderful. I'm just curious too about maybe it's an older person. Maybe it's an older person that, just feels like they're at the end of life and they might be talking about like mortality and morbidity. Is that something to be alarmed about? Is that something to be concerned about? Or do you think that that's more natural when you're getting towards the end of years and you might have an illness or you might have certain feelings that, I'm ready to go kind of thing? I'm just curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question and also brings up a lot of different other conversations, right? Like with assisted suicide and whatnot. My perspective on it is, I work with people, I work with individuals. And in that case, I really want to know what it means for them. I'm always going to be curious about what it means for them and ask about it as opposed to like, because I actually think some of those thoughts, even not for older people about mortality and whatnot, is pretty natural, but I never know what it is for a certain individual, right? So I think always kind of taking them seriously, taking them at face value and asking about them, inquiring about it is always, I would say, kind of my to go, just because like, even if someone is saying certain things and it's just part of their process, it could be helpful to talk about, right? Even if someone is saying something because they want attention, there's probably some pain and suffering there. And that's leading to them mentioning suicide and talking about these things that would kind of bring attention to them, right? It's probably a way to ask for help. So I think that always exploring, always being curious would be sort of my first thought in situations like that.
Yeah, good point. Because it could be a natural part of the grieving process. Maybe they lost their spouse, and they feel alone and they might just be like, oh, I want to be with my spouse or something to that effect. But it could be just in that moment, they could be feeling so overwhelmed with grief. And then even supporting them at that point and then helping them see the good in life and all the benefits. So sticking around until God calls you home, right? Well, Johanna Louie, thank you so much for being on the show today. I am so grateful for your work, and I am going to put your information in the show notes so that people can find you and learn a little bit more about Suicide is Different. It could be truly, truly helpful for those that are in need. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to the Human Beauty Movement podcast. Be sure to follow, rate, and review us wherever you stream podcasts. The Human Beauty Movement is a community-based platform that cultivates the beauty of humankind. Check out our workshops, find us on social media, and share our inspiration with all the beautiful humans in your life. Learn more at thehumanbeautymovement.com. Thank you so much for being a beautiful human.